Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by two guests, Dr. Erwin Berthier and RJ Asplund. Listeners, Erwin is co-founder and chief technology officer at Tasso, Inc., and RJ is vice president of commercial at Tasso. The company is developing innovative products to improve the user experience surrounding blood collection. And in our conversation today, we're excited to hear more about Tasso, their products, and how their work is helping advance anti-doping. So, Erwin, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Hi, Mary. Going well. Thanks for having us on the podcast today.
We're excited to have you here. And RJ, so glad to have you here as well. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. Thank you, Mary. Like Erwin said, looking forward to it.
Well, we are delighted to have you both here with us today. And I'd like to start by just introducing our listeners to Tasso. So, Erwin, can you share the story of how Tasso started and why it was founded?
Yes, Tasso was at the beginning was really a nights and weekends project of co-founder Ben and I. During our grad school efforts, we were working on novel biomarkers at the University of Wisconsin, and we had a similar challenge. Both of us, when we wanted to do our research, had to organize to have participants in research come into the university. We had to organize a phlebotomist there at the right time. We had to have all the equipment booked right at the same time as well. And there always was one of the three elements that were inevitably failing us and slowing down our research. And so we really wanted to find a better way to get people to access research and access clinical testing. So we thought there had to be a better way than asking people to take their car and come to the clinic or come to the university to give their blood. So that's really where it started. And from there, we got some really great backers at the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, at DARPA, and that funded it. And it became much more today.
Absolutely. I think you're doing amazing work making the process more convenient, both, like you said, on the patient or participant side, and then also on the research and clinical side as well, in terms of coordinating all of the logistics. So let's talk about the different applications of these products. I know the products that you're creating there at Tasso, Erwin, have applications that span a wide variety of industries, not just anti-doping. So what are some of these other industries and applications?
It turns out that blood markers or blood contains a lot of data that indicates many things about one's health, wellness, and it's used from research to pharmaceutical drug development when you try to find the right dose and prove the efficacy of a drug, in anti-doping, like you mentioned here, and the purpose of this podcast to make sure competition is clean, as well as obviously healthcare, right? Making sure we can measure someone's advancement of diseases, progression of chronic diseases, diagnostics. So it has a really wide range of applications. In fact, I think there's about 10 billion blood draws done per year. So it's a massive number.
Absolutely. Definitely a huge market there. And I'd like to get some details into how you entered this anti-doping sphere. In a lot of cases, people may not necessarily realize that their work may be relevant in anti-doping. So RJ, can you tell us, how did you get introduced to anti-doping or discover that the work that was going on at Tasso was relevant to this field?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting story. This kind of comes from a previous life of mine. Before I joined the Tasso team, I was working at a clinical diagnostic laboratory, and we were using the Tasso device as part of our work and research, but we were actually visiting USADA, so the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency in Colorado Springs, and we were visiting with their leadership and one of their main guys there, Dr. Matthew Fedoruk, and we were explaining a different technology to them, something completely different than Tasso or blood collection. It was a different technology on how it could support some of the anti-doping work and testing that USADA was doing, but we had a Tasso device with us. And as a part of our conversation, kind of as a complete sidebar, we started talking about Tasso, the collection device, the user friendliness of it, the pain level of it, and immediately a light bulb went off in his head on how this could benefit athletes and take sampling into more remote settings and test athletes more frequently to continue to keep competition clean. So in a way, it was an unintentional consequence that really got us introducing Tasso to the anti-doping agency. And then once they saw it, they completely interacted with the Tasso team to develop a product and an opportunity to really explore and expand in the anti-doping space. So it's pretty exciting how it happened.
That's so cool. So RJ, had you thought about potential applications for this device in anti-doping at that point, or was it just sort of you happened to have it in your back pocket?
Yeah, we had thought about it a bit because we knew the advantages of what Tasso brought in terms of remote sampling and frequency of sampling. And that's something the anti-doping space has always continued to try to improve upon. So we thought there was something there. But again, it wasn't the intent of the original meeting. But once that got introduced to the conversation, that's really where we started to drive into more and more depths and got an opportunity to bring Erwin and Ben and the Tasso team in. And then the rest is history. Developed a really cool product and cool opportunity that has grown to what it is today in the anti-doping space.
That's wonderful. So let's talk about some of the impacts that Tasso devices are having in terms of the athlete's experience or patients or just the sample collectors and other stakeholders who might be using the device or in organizations that do use the device.
There are actually applications at many levels, right? What we've seen throughout the years, Tasso is about 12 years old now. And really, when we started, it was this idea of not having to get patients to take their car and waste a half day of work and go to the laboratory. So there's this really convenience aspect. But obviously, if you think about blood draws, it's one of the things that we all do and take for granted. But if you ask anyone at any level of the blood draw process, no one likes it. From a patient perspective, it's painful. You got to see a needle. Even from a nurse or a phlebotomist aspect, we're looking at a process where most of it is done in the morning or in the evening when people are going to work or coming back from work. And you just have this massive line of patients. It's really a bottleneck of the whole operation workflow. And when you ask doctors, they would like to have data more often, but they tell us they can't get that and can't ask patients to get to the clinic more often. It's just wouldn't be feasible, right? And so we're seeing pain at every level of the blood collection process today. And I think this is really one of the more immediate advantages that we find that a painless blood collection process like the Tasso device offers. But when we look a bit further, this idea of being able to remove barriers to access clinical data leads to another really big benefit, which is this idea of being able to bring personalized diagnostics to someone. So we can, instead of measuring your blood at once every year or every 2 years, we can think about measuring critical clinical markers on a monthly, quarterly basis and really follow your health much more closely. And that is also done in the anti-doping space when looking at things like blood passports, where you're looking at the evolution of critical markers through time. Doing one blood draw is bad enough, but if you ask to do it every month, it just becomes unbearable. Specifically on a sports level, what we've seen is also there's something really specific to sports where you could take blood in different ways, but it's always either in your arm or in your finger. And as an athlete, you have to use your hands and your arms to practice your sport. And if you have a massive bruise in your arm, it's obviously going to affect your performance. That's another area where a device like Tasso is particularly beneficial in sports. And so we see a lot of benefit across the spectrum and not just for patients.
Absolutely. And what has been some of the athlete feedback that you guys have gotten about your devices?
I've been in a number of PCC symposiums, and it's great to see these symposiums that bring representatives of the athlete community. We've done a lot of work as well with Major League Baseball, amongst others. And by and large, we've seen a really, really positive response, both from the players and the player unions. It's been a key element in driving acceptance of blood draws. In many cases, athletes want to show that their sports are clean, but they are hesitant because of the pain of blood draws. So the Tasso device has been a big driver in acceptance of blood draws, so much so that oftentimes we are hearing feedback to say, well, that was so easy for my sports testing. Could I use this technology for everything else I have to do in my life, all of the clinical diagnostics and the wellness testing that I have to do? So we're seeing a really positive response.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I know Tasso has multiple different devices, so let's dig into some of the details here. One of the products you have developed is called the Tasso Plus. So RJ, can you tell our listeners what this device is and what exactly it does?
Definitely. So Tasso Plus is our latest generation device. It's FDA Class 2 cleared as a Lancet. And what it is, this is our wet blood collection device. So the device in and of itself adheres to your upper shoulder. The reason we chose the upper shoulder is it has a good density of capillary beds, but it doesn't have a lot of kind of nerve endings like your fingers do with a finger stick that are really painful. So it adheres to your upper shoulder. and it has a single fire lancet. You push the button, you barely feel anything. Trust me, anybody who's tried it, half the time they don't even realize that it actually fired and pierced their skin. And it collects blood into a micutainer. And depending on the clinical analytes you're looking at, that would depend on the micutainer that you would utilize. But we typically collect roughly around, I would say, 500 to 600 microliters of blood. And when that sample then gets shipped back to the lab, based off of the panel or the biomarkers that the individual or clinician is wanting to look at, that sample is then processed in a laboratory in a very similar fashion as a venous draw would be.
Oh, very interesting. We touched on this a little bit in our previous responses, but what benefits specifically does this Tasso Plus device offer when comparing it to maybe a traditional blood draw with a phlebotomist and the tube?
One of the great benefits, and Erwin's alluded to it in a couple of his comments earlier, is just you have the benefit of this fear of needles and this pain threshold that people just don't like. There's a lot of people out there that really don't like getting their blood drawn, or they're very tough sticks. Their veins are hard to find. Sometimes they have to get stuck multiple times. So one of the major benefits is everybody can get some blood from a capillary collection from their upper shoulder. You have a greatly reduced pain threshold compared to, let's say, a venous draw or a finger stick, and you're collecting a high clinical grade quality of blood. So you're not compromising any lab results as well, too. So the overall patient experience, user friendliness of it. And then the other thing is the ability for the device to be used remotely. So you don't always have to go into a draw station or go into a clinic. You can do it in the safety and comfort of your own home or in a remote setting. So that does have a huge benefit for busy parents or busy workers who can't just take time away to go wait in line for an hour or two to give their blood. So there's a lot of ways that it can benefit the individual to collect good quality of blood in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely. So that was the Tasso Plus, the wet blood collection device. You also have another product called the Tasso M20. So Erwin, we'll give you this one. Can you tell our listeners more about this product?
Absolutely. The M20 is a really interesting product. It was initially designed in partnership with a pharmaceutical company, and we did that to facilitate their clinical trial process. They wanted clinical trials to be more inclusive and to be able to reach patients that typically are not included in clinical trials. It was designed really specifically to be able to measure the concentration or the level of medicine in someone's blood. So we designed it to be an extremely precise tool to collect blood in a very controlled volume and to be able to ship it because it's a dried blood platform. So the sample gets dried before it gets shipped. So it confers a lot of stability. We can reach patients in really hard to reach areas or really extreme areas with climates that can be very, very challenging to keep blood stable at. Interestingly, that quality was also perfect for a lot of the measures that you have to do in sports testing. That is one of the reasons why it became quite popular with USADA and PCC.
Absolutely. And you touched on some of these, but what are some of the specific benefits that this Tasso M20 device offers?
I think the precision of collection, the ability to dry the sample, confers stability. It's been deployed, to recall that it's been deployed now in a range of countries, and not just in the US, internationally. We've supported a lot of studies in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia with this device. It's a four-wheel drive type of device. You can send it anywhere and have a great result out of it. So that's really what I see as the main benefit.
Wonderful. And then thinking about these two devices, I guess to summarize for our listeners, RJ, how do the Tasso Plus and this Tasso M20 device differ? And in what situations do you see each of them being most appropriate?
From a patient experience and quality of collection, they're very, very similar. I think the main difference that you see is the Tasso Plus is a wet blood collection and the M20 collects blood into a dry blood spotting matrix. The differences there is once the blood actually dries, you have a longer stability window depending on the biomarkers you're looking at. And it allows you to, what Erwin alluded to, collect in a lot of remote settings where wet blood needs to be shipped to the lab relatively quickly and may not be appropriate in much greater remoter type of settings. So the main difference really there is the Tasso Plus collects into a wet blood environment and the M20 collects into a dry blood spotting matrix environment. Where do I see them being most appropriate? You know, the Tasso M20 is really highly used in the pharma and decentralized clinical trial space. And as Erwin mentioned as well, that has really translated really well into the anti-doping and the athlete space. The Tasso Plus, the wet blood collection device, you're collecting a larger quantity of blood and you have a larger breadth of clinical biomarkers that you're able to analyze out of that blood. So that tends to be more appropriate in your more clinical and wellness types of settings where a physician's making a clinical decision off the back end of a result.
Very interesting. That makes sense. And Erwin, can you tell us, you've got these two devices, where are they at in terms of commercializing or the regulatory pipeline, and what steps remain before they could be widely adopted for anti-doping purposes or for clinical purposes, sort of in regular use?
A great question, and it's one that is unfortunately much more complicated than it sounds. But to make it simple, both devices have international clearances. So we really try to meet the needs of sports testing, competitions that are worldwide. So we're really expanding the regulatory clearances worldwide. In the US, Tasso Plus, for example, has a Class 2 FDA marking or clearance, so that it can be used as a standard blood collection device, kind of like a lancet or a phlebotomy needle, if you will. We have a device also cleared in Europe with a CE mark, and we're expanding worldwide to Japan and China and other countries in the close future. That's kind of the first step. The second step we're working on is to get clearances for actual testing to be able to use them for diagnostics. That's slightly beyond sports testing. Today in the sports world, they can be used as any blood collection device you would normally use.
So what do you think will help us move to that step of having them being widely adopted or sort of becoming the gold standard for anti-doping or sports testing?
I think at this stage, what we see today is there's a certain number of professional leagues like Major League Baseball and others that have been pioneers in this space and have really implemented those types of devices for some of the core tests that are important to their sport. And I don't want to be too bold, but I think they sort of already became pretty much standard in these areas. I think what we're going to be working on next with the PCC, USADA, and the sports testing labs is to expand the types of tests that can be done. Every sport has specific tests that are relevant to that sport. So to be used across all sports, really, I think the important part is to expand that test capability of what can be measured. And that's really the core of our R&D efforts at Tasso today.
Oh, wonderful. And I know, RJ, you mentioned that it was sort of serendipitous, this introduction for Tasso to anti-doping. How did you first make that connection with the PCC, the Partnership for Clean Competition specifically?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a pretty simple story, really. As RJ mentioned, we did a lot of work with USADA for a while, really at a scientific level. The initial questions that we were trying to answer was simple questions of, does this work? Does this measure the right things in the right way? And once that confidence started to build and we started to really think about bringing this into the leagues and making it used, that's when we got introduced to Ryan at the PCC and we got embedded in the network. So it was really through USADA that we were able to connect with PCC.
Oh, that's wonderful. And perhaps, RJ, can you talk about then, once that connection was made, how has Tasso been working with the PCC and other partners such as Major League Baseball and others to really advance the field of anti-doping and bring this product into those areas?
Sure. I mean, we've been working very closely with these groups. I think one of the things that we identified early on and with the support of USADA and the PCC is that in the anti-doping space, the challenges that you have with samples and samples being potentially tampered with was an area that we had to kind of explore and work around. And so we ended up developing a technology and partnering with a group called Innovating in the anti-doping space that creates kind of a locking mechanism or case that goes around the M20 collection device once the blood is collected. And what that allows it to do is then you kind of lock that sample in place. It can no longer be tampered with. So you minimize the risk of a tampered sample. And then it allows the sample to be split into an A and B sample. So if there is a positive test or a test that comes back out of range, you're able to then run a complementary or follow-up test with the B sample. That is one of the areas where we've continued to work on how to improve what we do in the anti-doping space outside of just collect the blood, but to ensure that the entire process from blood collection to sample analysis is done in a tamper-proof type of way as well versus just a patient-friendly or athlete-friendly type of way. So it encompasses the entire kind of workflow.
Absolutely. And I think, RJ, you brought up some really specific examples of how anti-doping might differ from other applications. Were there any other areas where there were special considerations that you had to think about in terms of the product development or enhancement for anti-doping use?
That was a big one for sure. Sample tampering and making sure that you're able to have an A and B sample was a fundamental part of the thought process as we grew and developed more and more into the anti-doping space for sure. Erwin, any thoughts from your end on that one?
A couple of things come to mind, and this is maybe more forward-looking, I would say, but when we're working with USADA and with the PCC as well, actually, thinking about the next generation of tests that need to be done, the athlete blood passports, for example. For those, we really have to think about, are there other types of samples? We started with dried blood, but moving on to other forms of blood that would support tests that are needed in the space. And it's really striking to me that it's really a race to develop better tests and more appropriate tests that may require other types of blood. So we're working on these things today, as well as I think there's an effort around being a little bit more virtual. There's a push to bring things to the home to be more convenient. And right now, having to send a person really to an athlete's home is pretty inconvenient and hugely expensive. And so some things we're considering is how do we collect a sample virtually while making sure we know everything about that sample, that it hasn't been tampered with. So things like proctoring or identity checks, making sure that we can have certainty that the collection process happened in the right way, but with just virtual monitoring. Those are topics that are, I think, next generation questions around anti-doping testing that are pretty specific to anti-doping.
Absolutely. And even just thinking about, I guess, general limitations of the products, perhaps we'll have each of you chime in on this one. What are some of the limitations that you're facing, or substances that you can detect versus what you can't detect, or situations in which these Tasso devices maybe aren't a good fit?
It's a hard question because a lot of it is still questions that we are working on actively. And I wouldn't want to be defeatist and say we can't measure anything. I think a lot of really, really smart scientists are developing some really advanced tests. Probably those people would be better to ask what can be tested or not. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, what we've seen is that pretty much anything that can be measured in venous blood can be measured almost equally well, if not just as well, with a Tasso device. There are very few tests that require so much volume of blood that you wouldn't be able to do it with a Tasso device. There are some, but they're not really relevant to anti-doping in my experience. So I feel to some degree that maybe one answer, to be in full transparency, that we try to promote a lot is this idea of athlete centricity. We don't like the idea of collecting 5 or 6 tubes of blood on an athlete. And so we try to promote an idea of being more targeted across all of the applications we're doing, whether it's clinical testing or pharmaceutical research. We think there's value in trying to really identify the specific tests that you need in a specific condition and really target that one test. If you're trying to do too much at once, then you start affecting the athlete's experience and you're losing some of the benefit of having these new technologies. So in cases where you need to do a slew of tests, 50 or 60 tests at once, it might be slightly limiting. The volumes of blood we're collecting are a bit smaller. But if you can have a targeted approach, then I think you can measure anything just as well, really.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And then the only other thing we haven't really touched on is cost. And I think this is an important consideration for anti-doping. And we talked about sort of the general convenience of not having the phlebotomist, et cetera, to have to coordinate. But can you, RJ, comment on the cost of the Tasso device and sort of the overall cost of blood collection, comparing this traditional version with the Tasso device?
The cost element is an interesting one because you have to look at what groups are currently paying right now for phlebotomy and mobile phlebotomy and the testing that they're currently doing in space. What the Tasso device allows these groups to do in the anti-doping world is they don't have to rely on a phlebotomist, or they don't have to bring mobile phlebotomy into, let's say, a spring training event for Major League Baseball or into a home to collect a sample. The Tasso device can be done without the guidance of a phlebotomist. So in doing that, you already eliminate a huge amount of cost that is incurred by these sporting groups. So for example, in the MLB side of things, they've shared with us that by just switching over to the Tasso device in their anti-doping programs, it has saved them north of roughly $1 million in costs on their end that they are absolutely ecstatic about. And it's part of why they want to explore how we can bring Tasso into more and more of their wellness testing that they do with their athletes and their employees as well, too. So cost is, we don't really look at it as like a cost per device. We look at it as throughout this process, how can implementing this device make it more athlete friendly, more user friendly, but also more cost effective for the league, which what that has done is it has allowed them to test more frequently as well too, which is incredibly important to ensure the cleanness and continued safety of the athletes as well.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned it. I think you're absolutely right. You do have to think about that bigger picture and just how freeing up some of those resources allows then sports or other organizations to reinvest them in strengthening their anti-doping programs overall. So I think that was a wonderful point to make. And we mentioned the PCC conferences and Erwin, how you've been able to present and meet with people at these different conferences and events in anti-doping. And you were actually a panelist in one of the sessions in our PCC conference last year. And of course, Tasso was a conference sponsor, which we truly appreciate. So Erwin, can you tell us more about your experience at the last PCC meeting?
I really appreciate the PCC conferences. I find them to be really, really interesting. The two things that I found in these conferences to be really exciting is the quality of the scientists that are brought together is really, truly amazing. We happen to work with a clinician here at the University of Washington who also has some projects funded by the PCC to develop some really advanced testing. There's scientists from the University of Cambridge from England that came to the conference. And so the scientific community, it's really people that are not just really doing this for the money and fame, but really because they love sports. I think that's something that I found to be super exciting. In the last conference too, there was a focus on bringing in also representatives of the athlete community and hearing some of their experiences around sports testing. There's a couple of ice skaters that were there and mentioned their story around how they missed a medal at the Olympics because of a sports doping event that happened in one of the medalists ahead of them. And the feeling that you have when you spend your life trying to dedicate to yourself to a sport and when you're affected by these kind of behaviors, it was really, truly moving, I'd say. So it was really an amazing conference.
Well, we're so glad you enjoyed the meeting. And I guess, RJ, can you comment on how Tasso overall has benefited from working in this anti-doping space and perhaps what you enjoy most about working in anti-doping?
Sure. Well, I'm a sports geek. I'm a huge, huge sports fan. I've always enjoyed sports. I've played them my whole life. I watch them. So for me, I'm kind of like a little boy in a candy shop when I get a chance to talk to some of these groups and see how Tasso has impacted them for sure. So it's really, really exciting. So the thing that I like the most about it is really seeing how it does impact athletes and how it does impact a sport to help keep it not only clean, but all of the athletes kind of on the same playing field. We know in sports, athletes will do anything they can to get an edge. That's part of what being an athlete is. It makes them the competitor that they are. And it's great to be a part of a program that can help athletes do what they need to do to get an edge, but making sure they're staying compliant within the framework of the laws. Erwin made that point about the ice skaters at the previous conference. These athletes work their entire lives to get where they are. And it comes without saying that there's nothing but hard work that goes in with it. But it's nice to know that Tasso is kind of a part of a group that's helping keeping everybody on the same playing field in terms of compliance with the anti-doping world. So that, for me, that's the exciting part about it, is because I'm a sports geek and seeing how Tasso can help to impact that, and now how other leagues are continuing to develop the technology and develop the processes where Tasso is a big part of what they're doing in their leagues, is really exciting.
Oh, wonderful. And Erwin, is there anything that you'd like to add about what you really enjoy about working in anti-doping?
In addition to everything that RJ said, I also find it to be a really amazing icebreaker when I take a flight and I talk to my neighbor on the plane. And it's a bit esoteric if we start talking about clinical diagnostics, but when we talk about how we can impact baseball, it's a way to relate to the broader public. And it's a really great way to also relate the technology to things that people care about. So I think it has a bit of a benefit beyond sports as well to frame the technology and make it accessible.
Absolutely. And I know there aren't only successes in Tasso's history. You've faced a lot of challenges. You've overcome a lot of these big struggles. So, RJ, can you tell us what have been some of the biggest challenges that you've faced in developing new technology and applying it for anti-doping?
I think probably the biggest challenge we probably face is just getting the athletes and getting the leagues comfortable with the technology. It's a new technology. It's different than what has been historically used in the past. And as we talk about early adopters, groups like the MLB and Major League Baseball, as early adopters started to adopt it and bring it in and start to really show the use case, you started to see the sports world kind of completely open up and become very interested in what Tasso can do and bring. So I think from a challenges standpoint, we had the issue of making sure that once that sample is collected, it's in a secure case that cannot be tampered with. That was an early stage challenge that we were able to meet and now have dealt with. There's the challenges, obviously, with the clinical side of things or the laboratory side of things in terms of processing the sample and understanding and building out the correct anti-doping panel that is important to each league and to each group. And then the last one is the adoption. And I think as we have been introduced more with USADA, more with the PCC, more into these sports leagues, we're starting to see adoption now really start to take hold and grow in a significant way. And I attribute a lot of that to Erwin and his ability to sit on the panels that you guys have and to interact with these groups and really help talk about the technology and what the benefits are.
Definitely. I think it is a really exciting time for Tasso and sport and anti-doping. And Erwin, did you have any other additional challenges or thoughts that you'd like to share on this topic?
I'll emphasize what RJ was saying. The thing that's really interesting to me is blood testing is something that's never been questioned for I don't even know how many decades. And it's such an established technology operation. So many people are not really questioning it. So that really was the hardest part. We spend a good part of our 12 years of existence just trying to convince people that the measurements, the science is right. And I think we're breaking through this barrier now, and it's great to see things start to move.
Definitely. Well, congratulations to you two and the whole team there at Tasso on these successes. And you've already had many successes with this company. So what are your plans? Maybe we'll start with you, Erwin, for the future of Tasso.
It's a vast question for a Friday morning, but we do want to expand and really fulfill the vision that we set out to create around making blood testing more accessible. There's a number of diseases, chronic diseases, whether it's diabetes, chronic kidney disease, but even cancers like leukemia that require blood testing all the time. And if you live in rural areas or if you're busy parents or if your kids are sick, it's just really hard. And a lot of people are not doing the testing they should be doing to monitor the progression of these diseases as well as they should. So we're going to be pushing in the close future to really make this a solution, both from a regulatory acceptance point of view and a clinical and reimbursement acceptance point of view. But I think downstream of that, we see a next revolution, which is really this idea of personalized diagnostics and personalized care, where we can follow a person much more closely over time. And instead of comparing you to an average human being, right, it seems irrelevant to me or very inaccurate, we should be able to follow a person over time and adapt treatments, adapt lifestyle choices to optimize one's potential really in a more personalized way. So that's what I see in the future. It's going to be a long road, but we're excited to do it.
Well, I think a lot to be hopeful for the future. And RJ, was there anything that you wanted to add in terms of ideas or visions that you have for the future of the company?
I think Erwin hit it again spot on. I think the only thing I would add, which both Erwin and I have kids and children, I think is ultimately, I see this also as a huge opportunity in the pediatric space to be able to utilize this with children. And that's always been a vision of ours as well, too. And we have a lot of research groups that are doing pediatric testing right now, and the feedback has just been phenomenal. And I would love at some point in the career of Tasso, as we continue to drive forward, that this becomes a gold standard of collection in pediatrics, because children are not the biggest fan of needles, and heel pricks and finger sticks are not fun. And having a fun, cool way to collect blood in that space, I think, is a really, really exciting area for us as well.
Certainly. I think the company has made tremendous strides, but at least in anti-doping, there are always new problems. So we like to have guests think big and outside of the box with us and think about what they could do to solve some of these big problems in anti-doping. So if we gave you all of the resources you could possibly dream up, RJ, do you have one question or problem that you would want to solve most in anti-doping?
I think if we had all the money in the world and we could just think sky's the limit, I think the ideal thing in the anti-doping space would be that a Tasso or anti-doping kit could be delivered into somebody's home, into an athlete's home. They could collect the sample completely remotely. It would eliminate the use of people having to travel around the world and chase athletes in their off season or when they're not in their training facilities. Collect a sample, get it back to the laboratory, and have it done completely remotely and completely eliminate the fact that you, like I said, have to chase people around the world half the time. And what that would really allow is the frequency to testing to go up because you just have reduced so much of a barrier cost that you can test athletes more frequently and continue to make the sports cleaner and cleaner and cleaner. We all know technology develops on the side of finding ways to cheat and improve athletic performance through substances. It continues that science is just as great as the science is trying to find ways to ensure that athletes are not cheating. So if we had all the money in the world and we could solve all these logistical problems, it would be being able to test an athlete anywhere at any time and do it in a remote way that cannot be tampered with.
I love it. I think that's a wonderful thing to spend all these unlimited resources on. Erwin, do you have additional thoughts or a different answer of what you would do with unlimited resources?
I think the vision that RJ is proposing is one that we share, and it's really this idea of making it so easy that it's not a burden anymore. But I think we could also add to that on the test capability side of things, I think that it would be amazing if the blood collected then can be used to measure such a broad range of panels, like potentially a proteomic, genomic panel, in such a way that it's more future-proof. One of the things that's always interesting to me in anti-doping testing is that we're kind of always racing to catch up with the next generation of doping agents. But it feels like there could be some broad data collection that allows us to predict or to look back at data that was collected and say, identify people that were doping in the past. And that would actually in turn really prevent or be prophylactic for people who would be tempted by that in the future, knowing that we're collecting enough data that you could be identified even years down the road without having to develop new tests. We could just mine the data in better ways. So working with labs that do broad panels of testing is something that I'd love to be able to do.
Absolutely. I think this idea of having this retrospective analysis possibility can be a really strong deterrent in anti-doping. And I appreciate you both dreaming big with us on our show and sharing a lot of insights about the Tasso device and everything that you guys have done there. So if our listeners want to learn more about you two or more about Tasso, RJ, what is the best way for them to do so?
Probably the best way to do so is to visit us on our website. So it's tassoinc.com. We have a number of tabs there. You can go to the contact tab where you're able to reach out to us. We've got a 1-800 number you could call in to provide your information. We have email address, customer service at tassoinc.com, where you could send in a request and have somebody will reach out to you. And there's some great tutorials on the website as well as videos of the device, how it's being used, so you can really see it in kind of real world process. So that's probably the best way to reach out to us. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to be a resource as well too. I know Erwin is incredibly busy with what he does, but my email address is rasplund@tassoinc.com, and I'm happy to engage and answer any questions anyone might have.
Phenomenal. Well, listeners, definitely take some time, check out the Tasso Inc. website, get in touch if you have questions, and we truly appreciate both of you joining us on the show. RJ, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having us.
It's been wonderful to chat with you. And Erwin, thank you again so much for joining us as well.
Thanks, Mary. It was a pleasure.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation, and listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here with us as well. If you haven't had a chance already, please subscribe to our show and rate and review it on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.